Start. Oh, just another thing. Again, all of those who have very generously supported this channel, much appreciated. I know I didn't reply to you individually by name, but be aware that I'm aware of everyone who donates whatever it is, and many thanks to you. It's much appreciated. Okay, to get back to our discussion of emerging from chaos, getting out of the chaos. We had discussed, based on the first, just one second, let me just mute wherever it is that's there. Okay, fine. We had discussed based on the first verse, or so rather the second verse in the first chapter of Genesis. Which is the second verse, which states that after God had created the in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, then the earth was null and void, and and darkness on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Okay, so we started explaining what that verse means, and we quoted a midrash rabbinic literature, which explains it as follows: that these four terms, tohu, vohu, choshech, and tehom, represent four different types of exile. Now, exile doesn't necessarily only mean, of course, it does mean that as well. It does mean as well physical exile, in other words, to be chased away from your land and exiled into a foreign nation. That, of course, it means as well. But exile is also an internal condition. It's an internal condition of a person who is out of touch with his inner core. Now, as we all know, that happens to everyone at some point in time during their lives. Some for longer, more extended periods of time than others, and some it only happens in a sort of in a more superficial sense. It's not something that touches the very core and gets sort of lodged over there. This state of alienation from oneself, or what we call in the terminology exile. So we stated that there were four types of inner exile. The first one is represented by the nation called the Babylonians, the Babylonian nations, which their particular, um, how shall I say it, their particular penchant, their desire, their where they went wrong was in idolatry. Um, what does that mean? It means that they worshipped nature without divinity. In other words, it was they worship nature essentially, that there's only a natural world and there's nothing beyond the natural world. Although the Babylonians themselves did believe in a god of gods, as the sages tell us, they believed that there was a god who was over the whole system, so to speak. But he has nothing to do with me personally. I have to worship the various forces of nature, and that is where I'm going to manage to get on in life by somehow or another appeasing or working with, or somehow managing to control the various forces of nature um, that we see today as a concept amongst academics to a very large extent, scientists as well, who are just always of the opinion that we're on the verge of being able to control.
Carjack. It happens in the middle of the day. It just Bradley. It happens in the middle of the day,
One second,
and it happens at
let me just mute this person here. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. Um, so to a certain extent, scientists today have the same problem. Um, Nature is simply a way of, that's the way the world runs, and we have to sort of somehow or another either fit in with it or control it, and not necessarily for the benefit of mankind. Unfortunately, it tends to leave out the ethical, moral dimension of life. We'll get to that a little bit more when we speak about today's topic. The second, the second exile is the exile of lust. The concept of lust, lust meaning lust for, it could be for many different kinds of things. Um, Amongst them, very possibly lust for food, lust for alcohol, lust for drugs, lust for sexual drive, and so on and so forth. Um, Primarily, the nation of Medea, the Medians, and the Iranians, essentially, the Persians at that time, were very soaked in unethical behavior as far as sexual um, issues were concerned. With tremendous lust for women, and we see that with Hashverosh, the paradigm of this kind of thing, the king of Persia, who we're going to read about shortly in another couple of weeks in the Purim story. So this king of Persia, whose name was Hashverosh, who eventually married Esther, but when he became king and he established his kingdom, he made a feast for 180 days. And it wasn't just a feast, it was essentially an orgy. And you can imagine, in pagan times, an orgy for a week, 10 days maybe, even a month would be excessive, but he went all out, 180 days. And this is another inner exile when the sexual act becomes, in particular the sexual act, but other things as well, but when it becomes not something holy, but just a matter of uh, enjoyment of the genitals. It doesn't. It's not a holy act, which is what it's supposed to be. Marriage in Hebrew is called kiddushin. Kiddushin is from the word kadosh, meaning holiness. So the way that's usually explained is that it's because the woman becomes sanctified to her husband, and she may not obviously have relations with any other man. And Since the time of Rabbeinu Gershom, the same applies to a man. You shouldn't have relations with any other woman outside of that marriage. But Kabbalah comes along and says, no, the concept of um, marriage and the purpose of marriage, which is to produce children and so on and so forth. But the act of sexual union, is a paradigm for, it's called yichud. When a man and woman are together, it's called yichud or zivug. Two terms for it. That's yichud and zivug is paralleled in Kabbalah by the concept of the adherence of the soul cleaving to God. Just as the two bodies cleave together, so too the soul cleaves to God. The soul is as sort of the feminine element, the female element, and God, so to speak, as the male element, cleave together, and that is called a yichud or a zivug, and this is regarded as an extremely holy act. So therefore, since this is paralleled in the sexual act, therefore we have to treat it as a holy act, as something that's not just um, Hollywood. Okay, I think we all understand what that means. Okay, so that is the second exile, and the third exile is the exile that we're going to discuss today, which is the exile of knowledge without wisdom, or essentially what might be called, you could say, knowledge without ethics, without God, without morality, without it's knowledge that's based on human intellect and not knowledge that is based on divine intellect. And that is exactly what the problem is. Who were the Greeks? What's the story with the Greeks? Well, as we know, the Greeks were a very, like to call themselves an enlightened people, which is interesting in view of the fact that the Torah over here hints to the nation of Greek, to the Greek nation, as we says, the Midrash says, it is called, this is the aspect of exile called choshech, darkness. They thought they were enlightened. The whole enlightenment and the enlightenedness of the Greeks was regarded in the Jewish world, in the Torah world, in the world, in the divine world, as essentially darkness. Why was that darkness? Because it was very, um, in many ways, very cold and brutal. I don't know if anyone is aware of this, but one of the great lights of the luminaries, you could say, I suppose, of Greek philosophy was Aristotle. There was Aristotle, whose teacher was Plato, and his teacher was Socrates. Socrates was a much more seemingly divinely inspired person, but by the time it got to Aristotle, who was the um, mind which the Greeks admired the most, Aristotle was in, I'm sorry, Socrates was in fact put to death by the Greeks because he disagreed with some moral issue, and they said that morality doesn't come into science, doesn't come into logic. There's no morality in logic, and in fact they behave that way. Aristotle himself says that if a child is born defective in some way or another, in other words physically defective or mentally defective, that child should be abandoned. In other words, go put them in the forest and leave them as food for the animals, or put them up on a mountaintop, let them freeze to death, and so on. A very brutal kind of society, a very and that was regarded as enlightened. Now, what happens when there is the religion of science or the religion of logic? What happens, unfortunately, is excuse me, is that one abandons everything else that has to do with the religious life. In other words, with the life of godliness. There's a famous philosopher. I think I mentioned him last time as well. Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a philosopher who wrote before the war, before the Holocaust, before the Second World War, and he sort of foretold what was to come. He was a very intelligent person, German philosopher, very intelligent person, but he saw what was coming down the pike. And he said like this. He warned that losing faith, he was talking about the Christian faith, which is the official religion of Germany at that time, which was becoming very secular. Germany was becoming very secular, as was the rest of Europe, but Germany was particularly prone to this. England at that time still had, the Church of England, and they were much more religious, as were apparently the French. But in any event, Nietzsche wrote that losing the Christian faith will mean abandoning the morality that Christianity upholds. In other words, there's no more a concept of love your neighbor as yourself. Rather, it is a will to power. There's no more concept of you shall not, thou shalt not in the Ten Commandments. Instead, people would live by the law of nature. In other words, the strong dominating or eliminating the weak. And this is a direct quote from what he said from one of his books. An act of injury, violence, exploitation, or destruction cannot be unjust as such, because life functions essentially in an injurious, violent, exploitative, and destructive manner. He said that's life. Life is destructive. The stronger force wins. The person who has more strength is the one who prevails. Now, this is completely anathema to the Jewish way of thinking, to the biblical way of thinking. The biblical way of thinking: love your neighbor as yourself. Help out your friend. You see the donkey of your enemy in this week's Torah reading. You see the donkey of your enemy, struggling under its load. Help him to unload the donkey. Compassion for even an animal. Right? There's no such thing as in the Jewish world as experimenting on animals. It is considered anathema. Even experimentation on rats is not actually allowed by Torah and rabbinical law. Experimenting, there are some cases when it might be allowed, but just experimenting on animals and treating them with tremendous cruelty and so on is regarded as unconscionable and unacceptable, completely unacceptable. In any event, that was Nietzsche. That was Nietzsche's the will to power. In other words, the strong rule and the weak maybe survive, maybe don't. Maybe the weak are simply pruned away, right? You have to prune a tree in order to make it grow better. You have to prune the nation in order to make it grow better. And that ultimately led to the philosophy behind the Holocaust that that unfortunately took away so many people. In any event, that was sort of the philosophy of the Greeks. There are two stories that very much illustrate where they were holding and what their mindset was. One is a story of a very great sage whose name was Yeshua ben Hanania. Yeshua ben Hanania. He was a very great sage at the time in Israel, and this is the time that actually the Romans had. It was the beginning, really, of the Roman Empire. It hadn't become as powerful as it eventually became, but the Roman emperor was very interested in trying to understand the difference between the wisdom of the Jewish sages and the wisdom of the Greek sages. So he sent this, after much discussion with this Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, he sent him to debate the Greek sages. Now, the debate was, if you just read it on the surface, you would really not understand what's going on, because the debate seems to be like a very, you know, like very strange. Like, what are they talking about? But they were talking in riddles that, as the Talmud records, the Talmud in Bechorot, I think page 8, if I'm not mistaken, in the Talmud. So the Talmud records like various debates that they had and arguments that they had. For example, one of them that you wouldn't understand without a lot of background is the sages, or the Greek sages, said to Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, let's just call him Rabbi Yeshua, said to Rabbi Yeshua, how would you reap a field of knives? How would you reap a field of knives? So he answered them with the horn of a donkey. So I said, but donkeys don't have horns. So he said, knives don't grow in fields. Um, what that is all about needs a long explanation, but that's the one I want to get to is the following. They said to him, how do you preserve salt that's going bad? How do you preserve salt that's going bad? It's going off. It's becoming moldy. How do you preserve salt that's going bad? And he said, you preserve it with the placenta of a mule. Now, if anyone knows what a mule is a creature that is actually it's a cross between a horse and a donkey. And this is not something that happens naturally. They're actually bred that way. They're sort of forced into a relationship, and the product of it is called a mule. And a mule cannot give birth. A mule is barren, right? It doesn't give birth. So the placenta of a mule simply doesn't exist. So that's what they said to him. They said, "There's no a mule doesn't have a placenta." So he said, "And salt doesn't go off. Now, it doesn't go bad." So what was the basis of their argument? We'll understand the basis of the argument, and this will show us the difference between Greek thinking and the thinking of the sages, or the way the Torah essentially thinks. What is the idea of salt as a preservative, and why were they asking about this salt that is going off? As we all know, salt is a preservative, and salt does not rot, it doesn't decompose, and so on and so forth. Salt is a preservative. Now, what they were really talking about was the concept of a covenant. The concept of a covenant. One of the covenants that was made, there's actually several covenants that were made, in fact, 10 covenants altogether. The Zohar really talks about five of them. The Zohar says like this: the first covenant was the covenant of circumcision, which the covenant that God made with Abraham. Okay. The second covenant, when I say second, it does not necessarily. We're not talking about in terms of time. Historically, actually, the first covenant was really the covenant that was made with Noah, which was the covenant of the rainbow. In other words, the rainbow represents a covenant. It's not that the rainbow is something that's mysterious and miraculous and so on and so forth. We know how a rainbow comes to be because sun shines through the raindrops, but it's a sign of something unusual. In other words, the refraction of light through drops of water, causing it to become a rainbow, is indicative of a certain pattern that there is built into creation. And that pattern reminds us about what our relationship to godliness should be. So that's the concept of the rainbow. So the third covenant is the covenant of salt, and the fourth one is the covenant of suffering. Unfortunately, that happens too much. And the fifth one is a covenant of the priesthood. I'm not going to go into the latter. In the priesthood, I won't even go into the one about suffering. Perhaps in a subsequent class, we might deal with it. But I want to talk about the concept of the covenant of salt, because that's what the Greeks were really asking about. They were asking about this whole idea of a covenant being something permanent. In other words, what kind of covenant was this? What was the covenant of salt? The covenant of salt actually had to do with a sign which was brought in. It was salt was used in the temple when there were various sacrifices in temple times and so on. But the covenant represented salt represented the idea of a covenant which would be something unchangeable and forever. So what the Greeks were talking about, what they were trying to get across to Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, was that times change, and therefore there's no such thing, or there's no usefulness of a covenant which is permanent. Times change, things have to change, circumstances change, your mindset has to change, your approach has to change, your way of doing things has to change. And therefore, they asked him, well, what happens when the salt, in other words, the sign of the covenant, starts to putrefy, it starts to go off, it's not effective anymore, it doesn't work. What happens then? And he answered them, there's no such thing. Just like a mule cannot have a placenta because that's what a mule is. It's the way it was created, the way it was came into the world, it came into the world in such a way that it cannot possibly have uh, give birth to other mules. So similarly, excuse me. So similarly, the it's impossible that salt would putrefy or somehow lose its power, and therefore the covenant, it's impossible that it should lose its power, that it should lose its effectiveness, that it should lose its meaning, its importance in the relationship between man and God. Now, what does the covenant represent? The idea of a covenant is that the covenant between man and God is that there's certain rules by which we have to guide our lives, by which we have to run our lives. Without those rules, without those set and unchangeable rules, these are not rules that can be changed because the circumstances change, or because logic changes. Basically, we're talking about the rules of the Ten Commandments. Essentially, that's really what it's all about. The rules of the Ten Commandments are unchangeable, and any divine pronouncement, in other words, any law which God set to be the law of mankind, the laws of mankind, is not something that can be not something that can be played with. It's not something that can be tampered with, because as soon as you start tampering with it, you produce a mule. You produce something that cannot reproduce itself. In other words, as soon as you start tampering with the fundamental principles of the proper life, the end result is death. A mule dies out without leaving any trace of its DNA into another creature. It simply does its work, and one day it dies, and that's the end of the mule. Similarly, a person's life in this world, if it's not based on an eternal type of covenant, then it's the life of the flesh, which eventually, after, as the traditional expression goes, after 120 years, person passes on, and that will be the end of that person, never to be seen or heard from again. Now, part of the covenant is that the soul is immortal; it's eternal. Why? Because the soul is essentially, as it says in the book of Tanya. Tanya is a Hasidic work, the sometimes called a little bit tongue in cheek, I guess, but it's called the Bible of the Hasidim, the Bible of Hasidic teachings. Um, so it says there in the second chapter that the godly soul which we all possess is part of God above. That's why it's called the godly soul. It's not yours to tamper with. It's not yours to. But if you don't focus on that, if that's not part, if that covenantal part of your relationship with God is completely ignored, and one lives the life of the flesh, then there's nothing left afterwards. There's nothing. It's just a person dies, and that's the end of their existence, as far as they're concerned. um, and therefore, the covenant is one that reminds us that there's there's a dimension of life that is far beyond just simply the life of the flesh. And therefore, one does things in a completely different way. I mean, when one realizes that there's dimensions beyond dimensions of things, it's not just all that you see in the physical world. It's not all, measurable and explained by principles of science, logic, and nature, and so on and so forth. When one realizes that there's a lot beyond that, then you look at life in a very different way. You look much more towards the meaning of life rather than just getting the best out of life for yourself. The Nietzschean sort of approach to life, power rules. So that was one idea that one discussion that Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania had with the sages, and again, it was about the concept of covenant being a permanent and unchanging approach to the basic moral and ethical rules of guidance of our lives. A second issue had to do with the story of Hanukkah. Hanukkah, as everybody probably knows, we celebrated about um, approximately just over a month ago, and the yeah, about a month ago. And the idea of Hanukkah is that we start with one candle, we light a second candle, third candle, etc., etc., as we go through the 8 nights of Hanukkah until you are lighting 8 nights, 8 lights altogether. Now, what actually happened? What was the story of Hanukkah? Well, what happened was that the Seleucid Greeks, that was a certain sect of Greeks who Greece was a world empire at that time, and had many outposts, and one of the outposts was in Syria. So the Assyrian Greeks, called the Seleucid Greeks, the Syrian Greeks, that was one of their outposts, were sort of in control, basically, of essentially of the Middle East, and particularly of the land of Israel. And they were able to enter into the temple and attempt to defile the temple in every possible way. In fact, they erected their idolatry, the statue of Zeus, in the temple, and they told everybody that that's what they had to worship from then on. Zeus, who was one of the Greek gods. In any event, and they demanded that the sages, as the representatives of the Jewish people, write on the horn of an ox that they have no part any longer in the God of Israel. Why on the horn of an ox? Because that was to remind them of the golden calf, the sin of the golden calf, which was the sin of idolatry, essentially. And if they would write on the horn of an ox that we have no part in the God of Israel, then they felt that they had achieved their their goal, which was to separate the people from proper divine worship. In any event, what did they do? They entered the temple and they defiled everything that they possibly could. Why did they defile? Because the concept of defiling in Greek philosophy did not exist in Greek philosophy. Why not? Because purity and impurity are intangible things. There's a certain level of spiritual purity, which is called tahara, and an even higher level, which is called kedusha, holiness. So purity and holiness. These are not concepts which can be measured. They're not concepts which can be analyzed as such. They're not real as far as the Greeks were concerned. This is not something you can touch. It's some kind of spiritual dimension, and we don't want any part in that. So they set about defiling everything that possibly could in the temple. Well, a group of the priests in the temple, called the Maccabees, I'm sure you've heard of them. They were Kohanim, they were priests in the temple. They got together and they basically defeated the Greek army, even though they were very few in number, but they somehow or another managed to defeat the Greek army. And the celebration of Hanukkah was that they found a single jar of oil buried in the courtyard. Underneath the flagstones of the courtyard, they found a single jar of oil that had not been defiled by the Greeks. It still had the seal, the wax seal on it, intact. It means it hadn't been opened or even touched, because if the Greeks had found it, they would have defiled it. They'd have found all the oils in the temple. Now, even though our sages tell us that even though it is possible to light the candelabra, it's called the menorah, the seven branch candelabra, it's possible to light it with oil that is not pure oil, spiritually pure oil. I'm talking about not filtered oil, but spiritually pure oil. Shemen tahor, you can light it with oil that had become contaminated, spiritually contaminated, if you have nothing else. But the fact that they found this jar of oil was a source of great joy, because the battle between the Greeks, one of the great battles between the Greeks and the Jews at that time, was over this concept of the invisible spiritual world where Tuma and Tahara apply, where purity and impurity are relevant concepts. So they found this jar of oil, and not having any choice, they only had one jar of oil, which is enough for one day of lighting the menorah, because they used a jar of oil a day. They filled up all the candles in the menorah and they lit it. And lo and behold, somehow or another, it lasted for 8 days. There's many ways of explaining it. There's many explanations. I don't want to go into it now. This is not the issue. But it's an interesting thing that the miracle was called the miracle of lights, the miracle of the menorah, the candelabra, the miracle of lights, as opposed to the Greeks, who were represented by darkness in those four terms of the world of Tohu, Choshech, darkness. The Greeks are represented by darkness, even though they were the ones that touted the concept of enlightenment. But enlightenment for them only meant intellectual enlightenment. It didn't mean anything beyond intellectual enlightenment. There was a certain British historian. I'm trying to remember his name now, but I can't. Who said that um, there are certain people who are very profound on a surface level, but when you dig down deep, they're very shallow. That was kind of the Greeks. They were very profound in on a very shallow level. Their profundity had only to do with what was in their heads. It had only to do with science and logic, things which could be measured. Now, if all that there is to life is things that can be measured, then life must be very narrow and very confined and very limited and limiting. And this again was the argument of the Jewish sages: is way, way beyond what you can see and you can measure and you can touch in the physical world. The the Maharal of Prague, the great Maharal of Prague, who lived in like the 1500s approximately, somewhere in the 1500s in Prague. He was the chief rabbi of Prague, very, very great figure. So he talks about a realm called the realm of the Nivdal, the realm of the separated realm, the realm of spiritual separation. It's a whole nother realm of existence. And this is what is discussed to a very large extent in Kabbalah. It discusses all the other realms beyond this physical realm. The physical realm in Kabbalah is regarded as the lowest possible realm that there is. In fact, there are four, really five, but four main spiritual realms, the lowest aspect of which is this physical world. So there's four spiritual realms. The lowest one is called Asiya, the world of Asiya, the plane of reality of the world of Asiya. And the lowest part of that is the physical world. Beyond that is the world of Yetzirah, the world of formation. In other words, that's the world of where inner inner dimensional structure is the primary focus in that world. Then there's the world of Bria, the world of creation, where existence and the meaning of existence and how things come into existence and what existence really is all about, that's the world of Bria. Then there's the world of Atzilut, the world of emanation, the emanated world, in other words, the world where godliness is revealed. Then there's a world beyond that called the world of Adam Kadmon that contains all of them and transcends all of them. The primordial world, which is called very often the world in God's mind, so to speak, the world of thought. In any event, so we see that there's not just one dimension beyond this physical plane. There are actually five dimensions beyond this physical plane, and that is all up to what is called the Tzimtzum, up to the contraction, where God begins to conceal himself. And then there's beyond that where there's absolutely infinite revelation, which is called the Or Ein Sof, the light or the revelation of Ein Sof, the infinite revelation. So we see, therefore, that the concept of Greek thought really was only very superficial. It only scratched the surface. Yes, they were profound philosophers, no question about it. They were profound philosophers, but the philosophy was lacking soul. The philosophy was based on it was based on science and scientific principles and on logic. And human logic is essentially limited. What you can see this to a very large extent today with with the modern atheists, that to find meaning in existence for modern atheists is a real challenge. Like, why are we here? What are we here for? Is something that they don't like. They can't. It doesn't come into the worldview. Like, what do you mean by that? Doesn't mean to say these are not intelligent people. There are some very intelligent atheists. Sam Harris comes to mind, for example, a very intelligent person. I think a person with a lot of integrity, but he's missing a whole dimension, one more than one dimension of depth, simply because he's only looking at the surface of things. Yes, of course, if you only look at the surface of things and you don't allow discussion of what's beyond the surface, then of course you're going to be lost um, when it comes to these things. In any event, that's what the Greek um, exile represented, the exile of essentially nature without divinity, without godliness, um, without those other dimensions. And the way out of that exile is to start realizing that, of course, there are other dimensions to existence. There's meaning and purpose to existence, as you probably know the famous works of Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor who was a psychiatrist, became a psychiatrist, and he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, a very important book that he felt was one of the things that was missing in modern life, and it was missing in certainly missing in Nazi Germany. That there was no meaning beyond the meaning of the moment. There was no meaning beyond power. There's no meaning beyond natural forces, and therefore, um, what happened. The Nietzschean sort of result. In any event, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. Let me just see some of the chats away. I'm sorry, I haven't been looking at them. Yes, Rosh Chodesh Adar can certainly help. That's true. We just started tonight. Is the first day in the Hebrew calendar, in the Jewish calendar. The day begins at night with sunset, or when the stars come out. Is already the next, regarded as the next day, not like not at midnight, but more sort of the natural cycle of when the stars come out, or at least when the sun sets even, is yeah, Mule is sterile, yes. So it is now the month of Adar, which is the month in which Purim takes place. It's a month of tremendous joy. Mishanichnas Adar, Mari B'Simcha, when Adar comes in, joy increases. And perhaps next week I'll explain to a certain extent why. Um, although next week I want to finish with the Romans, the Roman Empire and the Roman exile, the exile of Edom. Michael Holroyd, I'm not familiar with him. I assume you mean he's an atheist. Could well be. I'm not familiar with him, but anyway, there's no lack of them. There are plenty of atheists in the world, but I think most atheists are atheists because they never thought, they don't have the education, they were never introduced to a deeper way of thinking. What I think is a deeper way of thinking in any event. Um, okay, any questions, ladies and gentlemen? If I'm allowed to still say that. All right, doesn't seem that there are too many questions. I'll wait another couple of seconds. Thank you, Wendy. How are you? How's everything going? Drop me a message, perhaps, or an email or whatever. And, all right. Okay. Hi, Ellen. How are you? Thank you, Justin. Couldn't the placenta have enough of the mule when it was born? um, I mean, I assume that when the mule was born, there was a placenta following the mule, but the placenta of a mule doesn't exist. It doesn't have a womb. But anyway, that's what Rabbi Yeshua answered them. You preserve salt with the placenta of a mule. In other words, you can't preserve something which doesn't need preserving with something that doesn't exist. I was thinking of comparing the Mule basically to sort of a hybrid kind of, when you start making hybrid philosophies, I guess you could say a hybrid thing would be, for example, a Toyota Prius. It's not this, it's not that, it's not an electric car and it's not a fuel car. Yes, a Toyota Prius is a very good car, and I'm not trying to knock it or anything like that, but in a sense, it's a hybrid, right? It's a hybrid. So when you start making hybrid philosophies. In other words, when you start making hybrid fundamental principles, the fundamental principles on which really the universe runs properly, in other words, basically the Ten Commandments or the Seven Noahide Laws, when you start making hybrids of those and connecting them with all kinds of other things, you're going to lose both. It's not going to be um, it that itself cannot preserve anything. And I think that's a lesson to us all, that the ancients who received divine knowledge by way of not by way of thought processes, but by way of prophecy, by way of divine inspiration, um, had a much more truthful experience of things, because our minds play tricks on us all the time. The mind is not an infallible piece of equipment. It's very, very fallible. First of all, in terms of memory, and just in terms of how you see things. Two people could see the same thing and explain it completely differently, as we know. Yes, belief in God is fundamental and distinguishing principle of Judaism versus other philosophies. Um, Certainly, Greek philosophies, and a lot of modern philosophies do not. Um, who was that philosopher that said? Uh, was it Descartes, maybe Rene Descartes, that said about they asked him, where is God in your philosophy, and he said, I have no need for that hypothesis. um, could have been Descartes, it could have been someone else, I'm not sure, but I have no need for that hypothesis. Well, we see where that landed up. um, yes, I mean, the covenant, the relationship, the unchanging relationship uh, with the creator, essentially, that unchanging relationship is fundamental to a system of philosophy and ethics and understanding and acting properly in the world. Without that, we're stuck. Then it just becomes, things evolve and they change. I mean, this latest fad, and if anyone is insulted by it, I'm sorry, but this latest fad of no gender is the opposite of scientific, in my opinion. And it's a craze which will die out in 5-10 years, and then the lawsuits are going to start. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is going to die out. And I'm not saying that some people don't genuinely have an attraction towards members of the same gender, the same sex, but um, to deny that there is such a thing and it's all just up to you to decide what you want to be is completely nonsense. It doesn't make any sense at all. Probably going to be cancelled for this, but oh well. um, all right.